Arizona Film Festival. I'm Kathleen Glenn, and I've been doing these panels for the last couple of years, every morning, so any day this week, I think through Saturday you can come. They're different every day. And they, unfortunately, because we print the program so far in advance, they kind of change around a little bit, so you should really double check to make sure that you want to be at the panel that you're coming to. So this morning we are going to talk about writing and a little bit about producing, and I'd like to introduce Larry Brand and Rebecca Reynolds, and they I don't want to, how would you describe it? You don't co-write, you...
Well, we have. We've written 2 scripts that were produced in a bunch of felt deals.
So you would say that you're co-writers?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, anybody in the room that is writing a script, or... Okay, great. That's really great. Wonderful.
I hate competition. Stop writing right now.
I like to be a co-writer.
Okay, so I live in Michigan, and we have a film festival there called the Traverse City Film Festival, and I met Rebecca. Actually, I admired her from afar for a while, and then I got to be friends with her, and then I met Larry. They had a film going on, and really interesting stuff, and their producer, what would you call Jim?
He's a producer.
He's a producer. He's here as well, and he's going to join us in a little bit, and we're going to talk about a couple of other things. So, the idea of writing and how you do this back and forth. Well, let's talk about your films first. So you're here with what films? Go ahead.
We're here with the Coexist comedy tour and The Girl on the Train.
And they've already screened.
They've each screened twice, on Saturday and then yesterday.
Okay, and Coexist is really a documentary.
Yeah.
So we can talk about writing for documentaries and how much they're written and
Then we have some questions for you.
Okay. I can't give up my secrets.
I think you have a little more to do with documentaries.
A little bit more. So, so Coexist was, well, were you working on Coexist? I mean, were you working on Girl on the Train before Coexist?
Actually, Coexist was first.
Okay.
It was a project that kind of fell into our laps through a comedian. I don't know if anybody here saw either of the movies, but I'd met this comedian who was doing this Coexist comedy tour about 6 comedians of different faiths that do this comedy routine, and they each do a set, and they make fun of each other, make fun of themselves, and the purpose being to demonstrate how the religions coexist. And so we shot it in one night, and while I was cutting the movie, we learned that the Christian was leaving. He refused to be part of the movie. We didn't know why. We never found out why. And so the Coexist title was in jeopardy for obvious reasons. And we decided that the only way to correct this was to find a replacement Christian, find another Christian. So we
Find
toured.
another funny Christian.
Right.
And if you were writing this story, would you thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could just make the Christian leave? Or
Well, it's funny you say that.
Versus
and
being
obviously, knowing documentaries, you know how important it is to be handed something like this. It was a
Right.
gift.
Yes.
And you know, I'm not known as a workaholic. My view of life is if you wake up before 10 o'clock in the morning, the first thing you should do is take a nap. So I wasn't happy about the idea of all the extra work, but in the same conversation, when the guy was telling me this bad news, I had these 2 simultaneous thoughts. One which is, this is going to be enormously problematic. The other part of me, the filmmaker part of me, immediately knew this was great because we had a plot point, we now had a narrative, we now had a story. And it actually breaks into, interestingly enough, because it's not written, but it does work into a kind of a 3-act structure. The first act we find out that he left, the second act we're trying to find a new comedian, the third act is the resolution of the situation. So even though it's not written, it's not scripted, it's interesting how a good documentary, and I'm sure you can speak to this, really does have a plot, and you have to find the plot. And so what started out as a concert movie turned into a search for a funny Christian, and we knew immediately, we had all these auditions. If they're good, and if they're bad, they're good, because they're funny in the way that they're bad.
Hang on a second. The first row doesn't think there are any funny Christians. I can tell this right now.
Well, that's the Buddhist section right here.
Well, I think one of the things, and you need to consider this for writing, is the idea that when these things happen, you have to really have this open mind. You really have to go, of course that was going to happen, and then you have to deal with what that is. So in your case, it was, you're right, it was great.
And as Larry said, we were just shooting 6 comedians back to back to back to back in one performance in a theater in Sacramento, and maybe we could have sold it to Comedy Central, but they would have had DVDs to sell at their concerts, and that would have been it.
And it would have been so sweet. It would have been disgusting. I mean, everybody getting along. I mean, that's really not exactly what drama's about, is it?
So in other words, you got there, let's say, and then you thought, wait a minute, there's a bigger idea here.
Yes.
And this could be a film.
Yeah, I mean, it was always, yes, it went from a concert night to something that had a plot. And I think that really, because what happens when you add plot, and this is really about screenwriting, and I think this is kind of an important point, that if you're watching a concert piece, it's utterly dependent on the quality of the performances, and even great performances after an hour and a half, it's a lot of comedy to watch. There's something about plot. I don't know how many of you find yourself watching a movie on, HBO or some local channel, and it's not really very good, but you kind of want to see how it resolves. You kind of want to see how it ends, even though you don't really, it's not a well-written piece, but there's something about plot that really hooks you into a story, into a movie. And it just adds something that transcends the actual material you're looking at. So it certainly makes it more commercially viable, and it makes it more enjoyable to watch, because now it's kind of like, we obviously want you to like the comedians, and we think the comedians are very funny, but you can't laugh for 90 minutes straight. So now it's funny, but you also want to see how it resolves.
Not without an adult beverage, anyway.
So, and then, was Girl on the Train right after?
Actually, there was a little overlap because, we had to start, we were starting Girl on the Train, but we were finishing, and they both released last year. So this is the first time, this will never happen again to us at a film festival. Someone said, I loved your film, and we said, which one?
Well, one lady came up to me, and I assume she was talking about Girl on the Train, which is a film noir thriller, and because it was the last one to screen, and she said, I really enjoyed your picture. I said, well, thank you. And she said, I thought it was so funny, all those funny. And there were some funny moments in Girl on the Train, so there was still a moment where, why is she picking that out of all the things in the, and I realized she was talking about the other movie. But, cutting a documentary, as obviously it takes a long time. You usually shoot a lot more footage than you do in a feature film. And a feature film can shoot 10 to 1, 15 to 1, but a documentary can be 100 to 1 in terms of how much you shoot to how much you actually have in the movie. So the cutting overlapped with the pre-production of Girl on the Train.
So, with the documentary, after you had the general footage, which you shot in one night, but you also then decided to go and shoot little things with each comedian, right?
Yeah, we wanted to interview pieces with the comedians themselves, which we tried to pick kind of nice, visually interesting and arresting kind of backdrops. And I kind of incorporated in the film again to kind of keep the pacing going. Each comedian has about a 10 to 12 minute section where he's just doing his stand-up, or she in the case of the Muslim. And I break it toward the end of the bit, because there's a point where if you do it toward the beginning and the middle, then you've got a lot at the end. So you want to kind of get the audience really into the comedy, and then finish with kind of a punchline after the interview. So you kind of try to integrate the interviews in such a way that it helps the flow of the piece.
So did you write those? I mean, as far as, what I want to do is get into a little bit about writing for documentary here. And the idea that when you know that you've got, you've got your night of comedy that you've just shot, and then you think, well, wouldn't it be great if we went and visited these people in their hometowns or whatever? Okay, so now you're writing.
Well, it's scripted in the sense that we know, cut to scene of Keith talking or Tappan talking. Obviously, they're coming up with their own material. I'm not telling them what to say. I'm coaching them in the sense that I know what I want them to talk about in the limited sense of we want to get some of the material about how they felt about the Christian leaving the show and so on. So in a structural sense, it's written. What they're actually saying is not. Now, because of the problem we had, the three of us, Rebecca and Jim and I, wound up being part of the picture ourselves. And Jim and Rebecca didn't always know what the problem had been, because basically I was the cause of the problem, because I hadn't given them the contracts that they were supposed to sign had been, my assistant had given them the wrong contracts, which were audience release forms, which basically says you're signing away your life for nothing. And then the Jew discovered this and said, well, what are these contracts here? So they were the wrong contracts, and then the Christian overheard that, so he didn't sign, the Jew didn't sign. We could have sorted it out in a 2-minute conversation, but by the time it was sorted out, the Christian, for other reasons, had decided not to leave the show. So Rebecca and Jim didn't know all this. So when I'm doing my interviews with Rebecca and Jim, I'm kind of feeding them the information. And so I'm not really scripting it in the sense of telling them what to say, but I'm telling them what really happened, so they're kind of giving me what I need, and as I'm looking through camera, I kind of need them to say something like this. And when I'm interviewing myself, and I'm in the movie too, and to those of you who've seen it, who's interviewing me? Well, the refrigerator was interviewing me, because I set it up in my apartment, and I know that long lenses are more flattering than close lenses, so I put it as far away from me as I could. And
he used the short lens on Jim and me. Really short.
You just adapted to documentary filmmaking, like, okay, it's a one-man band.
It is, and the hard part was, when I initially started, I didn't have a monitor, so I would have to get up, shoot some footage, and try different lighting arrangements. I live in an apartment that has an amazing view. I'm on the 35th floor, and it would have been very easy to just close the blinds and then you light it and you shoot it, but you wanted to see the view. It opens up the movie. So in order to do that, you have to put a lot of light on your face. It was trial and error, and I was finally I got a monitor so I could actually watch what I was doing. It was insane. But so I'm actually talking to the refrigerator when it looks like I'm talking to somebody in it. So that part, of course, I kind of arranged what I was going to say, and I written down what I was going to say. So there's a little scripting in that sense as well.
So let's talk about Girl on the Train and how you, how do you guys do this? Do you go sit in a room together, don't
We
come
didn't
up?
write that one together.
Oh, you did?
No,
You wrote it.
that one I wrote, right.
Okay, and so, so you wrote it, and then, why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it's kind of an unusual process for me, because I normally, if I get an idea in my head, I sit down and I write 3 drafts, then I do a polish, then I usually send it to Rebecca first, and if she doesn't give me enough criticism, I make her read it a second time. And, so she's my first line of defense, because we've written together, so she knows the rhythms, and she knows my tricks and stuff, so she kind of can keep me honest. But I'd written the script 15 years ago, actually. And it got to the 3rd draft stage. I'd gotten about halfway into it, and for some reason I put it down, which is unusual. Usually if I get that far, I might put something down after 2 pages, but if I get that far, I'm usually going to finish it. And I had started to work on an idea for us, for our company, and I liked the idea of the girl on the train, and I was talking to Nikki, the lead actress in it, and we wanted to do kind of a noir thing, and so I had these ideas circulating, and these kind of intellectual kind of stretches of dialogue and philosophical, but it didn't really have a plot. And then for some reason, I got this old script. I found that I had transferred it to Mac files, and I found it, and I looked at it, and I said, this plot's pretty good. It just didn't have a heart, it didn't have a soul. And now I'd had this kind of understanding of what the movie really should be about, based on this new material. So I kind of took the plot of the original, and then I added all this new material. So in a weird way, it took 15 years to write. But the actual writing was, a few months for the first one, and then another few months for the second one. So it's an unusual kind of process. And then after that, I send it to Rebecca, and then I get her feedback, and then, again, we go through that process many, many times.
And if you've seen the movie, I referred to this when we were passing it around to our executive producer to get investors. I referred to it by its Native American name, the script you must read twice, because it's a very dense, layered script, and it's very hard to read what you're seeing and the dialogue, because they overlap. So it's a very complicated script, I think, made all the better by this process he went through.
Well, it was very. How many people here actually saw the movie Girl on the Train? Okay, so we have a fair number saw it. You can imagine it's a little hard. It's not that hard to follow because you're seeing what's on the screen. When you're reading the script and you're hearing a voiceover, it's very hard to relate that voiceover to what the image is on the screen. Even if you're a professional and you've read a million scripts. It was a little hard to follow. You kind of got the gist of you understand the dialogue and all that, but it wasn't a very easy script to understand what happened in it at all times, or what you're seeing on the screen, which is ultimately what you want to do as a screenwriter. The first thing you do is you have to create these impressions in the reader of what they're seeing on the screen. And a lot of times in that movie, what you're seeing on the screen is one thing, but you're hearing a voiceover about another thing, and unless you're paying attention to the little VO after the name, it can be quite confusing to follow. So it was a much more difficult script to really follow than it was a movie to follow. And even the movie does kind of, it's a movie you have to see twice, I guess.
And you knew that you were going to direct it.
Yeah. So I kind of knew what I wanted.
So do you think that when you're writing a script and you know that you're the person that's going to direct it, that you write that in a different way? Like a lot more about because a lot of scripts I read, I'm thinking, oh boy, where are they? What's going on? It's really just the dialogue.
Yeah.
And so then, it's going to, a couple of different directors, and then they're going to take that dialogue and create the world.
Yeah.
So because you've already created it, and because ultimately you're going to direct it, does a lot of that go onto the page?
Well, and this is kind of an important point for screenwriters. You don't want to direct the movie in the script. You don't want to write close-up or wide shot. What I've always done, even on the first movie that we wrote together, Backfire, which is back in the late 80s, which was directed by Gil Cates, and Rebecca and I wrote it, there was a clear notion of what the sequence of images was. Who you were looking at, kind of the idea. And the director, Gil Cates, was very, very respectful of the script, and he kind of very often shot stuff the way we'd written it. But it's a balance between really strongly conveying the flow of images, but not really directing the movie. So I kind of developed a style where I use the slugs, the kind of black interior. I don't really use that in the way that most writers do. I use that to establish we're inside the apartment, or we're on this character or that character if that's important, or we're looking out the window. So it reads a little bit more novelistically than a normal script. So, but I generally write this movie as well. It's not. I still try to make it as clear as possible, because even though I'm going to direct it, other people are going to have to read it, especially the actors.
Right.
And you certainly want the actors to be clear about what's going on. So I don't write any differently if I'm trying to sell a script or I'm writing a script for me to direct. I write exactly the same, because the first people that we're going to have to impress are going to be actors. And so the clarity is very, very important. And with this, I think where the clarity was a little bit obscured by the structuring, the time structuring, the actors are generally looking for, the old joke that I forget it's
De Niro.
Right, the De Niro joke, bullshit, my part. So I always try to make a lot of my parts. And as long and talky as the script, as the movie is, the script was even longer and talkier. And I always understood that a lot of these huge chunks of dialogue are going to be trimmed down. But I think that's an example of kind of more is more. And when you're actually editing, then less is more. So you kind of, but you want to give the actors something to sink their teeth. You know, when you're getting somebody like Stephen Lang, you know, whose weekly pay is greater than the entire budget of our movie, he's not doing it for the $1,500 a week we give him. He's doing it because he likes the part, or what, you know, even less. I don't know. We didn't give him a lot of money, you know. So when you're attracting actors that really don't need the money, they've got to do it for the part.
And that's why they will work way, way below their pay grade.
So let's talk a little bit about television, and tell us about your television writing career.
Well, the first thing that Larry and I wrote was for television, and we were neighbors in Hollywood. We lived right across the courtyard from each other, and I was doing acting in some television series, and he was writing novels, and we decided to look at the upcoming television season, and we kind of made a bet that we could write an episode of a show and sell it on spec. And we picked, it was a whole different system back then. New shows came out in the fall, and that's the way it was, and you knew what they were. And so we looked through the TV guide, and we decided to pick one that was just coming out, and we picked The Fall Guy because I knew it would make it. It was Lee Majors. He's a stuntman by day, he's a bounty hunter by night. I mean, it just had success written all over it. So, because if we'd picked a spec script, if we'd written a spec script for something that lasted, 3 episodes, it wouldn't have worked.
And you happen to be friends with the star of the movie, the show, and the producer
yes,
of the show.
And the producer.
She leaves that part.
And so I took it right over to the office, and the gal there at the desk said, she said, well, what do you have? I said, I have a spec script for Glenn. And she put it in his pouch. This is the old days. She put it in his pouch and sent it to Hawaii overnight. And that was our first show, and we were their #1 show that season. But that was the last thing we wrote for TV, for episodic TV. And since then, I've written for the HBO series Arliss. I don't know if you ever saw that, starring Robert Wall. I was a writer-producer on that. And I also wrote with Robert and another guy several comedy specials called Assume the Position with Mr. Wall. And they're like a history show, history comedy.
And do you guys have any TV ideas now, or are you off that and just in the...
Oh, you always have a TV idea. TV's where the money is.
Okay, so what show would you like to write for?
I thought you meant like coming up with our own ideas.
Well, that too.
It's very hard to write for series television. The good shows, the HBO stuff and Showtime, really is very driven by huge talent, huge names. So it's very hard to break in there.
And what do you watch? What do you admire?
Well,
Writing-wise.
True Detective is, I think, the best new show on television. Shameless, I love Shameless. There's nothing really on network, I think, that I watch. But some of the original stuff on HBO.
So no guilty pleasure? No, like
Pawn
Dancing with the Stars?
Pawn Stars. I love Pawn Stars. Yeah, that's my guilty pleasure. No Honey Boo Boo, but I do like Pawn Stars.
And how about you, Rebecca?
Well, interestingly enough, Jim and I cut the cable 3 weeks ago, right before the Olympics. We decided we were watching, in northwestern Michigan, there's, like everywhere else, there's a cable monopoly. And I was watching Good Morning America for 30 minutes with a cup of coffee and a cat. And then we were watching Justified and, I don't know, The Blacklist. And there were only like 4 shows, network shows we were watching. And so we just decided, let's cut the cable. So we're watching series on Netflix, and we're in the 2nd season of Breaking Bad. And we became instant binge watchers, and then it was like the 6th episode of season 2, it was like, that's enough, we just have to take like a 2-week break, and then we came here. And House of Cards, and we watched both the British version and the version with Kevin Spacey. So we've become Netflix, Hulu Plus.
Now, have you watched Portlandia?
We haven't watched Portlandia, we're saving it.
Portlandia.
Okay, because you have to watch the Portlandia episode about binge watching. Have you seen that one?
No,
It's excellent.
I'm thinking about a season, but it's hard to find though. That's the only problem with Portlandia. I've got my DVR set to record them, and there was just
Yeah.
they were just recorded like a 15-minute. Is the 15-minute episode?
Yeah, that sounds like them.
Yeah. It's a terrific show. It's on IFC, I think.
Yeah, it's on IFC. That's a great show. So, let's see here. Let's talk about with Girl on the Train. Are you guys interested in talking about the process of writing?
Yes.
Okay. So, first you need a pencil. Okay. Yeah, tell us about that. Everybody wants to know, well, what kind of room do you need? Do I need to buy an Apple computer? How do you write?
Definitely need an Apple computer. But that's just because of the crashing, not because of the writing.
But writing, for me, it's there all the time. Somebody says something and it's like, wow. And then people are asking me questions, going, what? Because I'm in some other story in my brain. Getting that story out of your brain and onto paper is the task. So,
Well, I think the task is sitting down, actually. I'm not particularly, anybody who's seen the movie, this may sound kind of strange, but I'm not a particularly complex, or kind of tormented artist. It comes very naturally. The hard part is just sitting in front of the computer. The hard part is kind of just getting off your ass and then start writing. And so it became very much, when I was starting out, I just said, I'm going to write 6 hours a day or however many hours a day. And the trick I played, I never get writer's block. And the reason I don't get writer's block is the trick I play in myself is, I say, I don't care if it's any good. It doesn't matter if it's good. If it's not good, no one else will ever see it. So I just start spitting stuff onto the page. And it becomes very utilitarian. The first draft is very just get the stuff out there, get the plot out there, get an idea of the dialogue. And I would say that between the first draft and the second draft, maybe I will add 40%, but ultimately, by the time it's finished, the first draft, maybe only a certain percentage is even in there anymore. It gets added, and then I'm much stronger editorially than just coming up with stuff. So I would put a lot of stuff on a page and then cut out the crappy parts, basically. It's kind of like the idea of Michelangelo finding the David in a chunk of marble. It's like I'll spit a lot of stuff on the page and then just carve away the stuff that I don't like. And so maybe an odd kind of way to look at it. Now, on the other hand, there's some stuff in The Girl on the Train. There's that long kind of poem that the lead actress tells at the end when she's on the monitor, which basically came out in one piece, almost exactly the way it is. I cut some parts out, but it was like a poetic moment I had, and I just sat down there, I wrote it. It virtually never changed. Other times you'll change things, again and again and again and again. But I think, for writers, starting out writers, or people who are struggling with writer's block, my trick is that I just sit there and I write, and I say, if it sucks, it sucks. No one's ever going to see it other than me. And that takes a lot of the burden off. I think a lot of writer's block has to do with this kind of notion that I'm setting it down and it has some kind of permanence to it. It doesn't. It's as only as permanent as you want it to be. And if you cut away the stuff that isn't any good, you're going to have some stuff that is good, and if it lasts 90 minutes, you've got a movie. If it lasts 3 minutes, you've got a problem.
When I came in, started writing, it was after I met Larry, as I said, but I had come from acting, and I took a class with Sid Field. At his house. It was the early years. But Larry said, he said, 1 page a day, 120 days a screenplay. 2 pages a day, 60 days a screenplay. It was like, oh, I get it. This is the, poop or get off the pot speech. But I find that that's true. You just have to sit down and start. And it's never more important than when you're writing on a television show like Arliss. We would come in, we would pitch ideas, we would get assignments, and someone said, how do you write comedy on demand? Well, the word fear comes up. I mean, you're being paid to sit down, and you can't wait for the muse. You can't wait to be inspired. We had every television show has their certain rules. With us, it was always, what does Arliss want, and what does he really want? And that meant a lot to me coming from my acting training. And it was only after we had sold a couple of scripts that I went on and got an MFA in playwriting. And that was a whole other thing. And I love the assignments. It's like, go home and write 10 5-minute plays. And you just have to go home and do it. It's homework.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the poetic moment for a minute. That is, if somebody said to me as a producer, right now, near the end, there's going to be this poem. My eyes would like roll in the back of my head and going, oh boy, no, there's not going to be a poem. But, so is it that you felt, as you were writing it, you yourself had wrote a poem, or you thought this actress or the character is a poetic person, or were you thinking about how this this poem was going to maybe ramble on for a while? How do you write it? Tell me about it, because to me that's like
Yeah, well,
that's my first edit.
I wouldn't pitch it to a producer as a poem. It was in the sense that it came out in one piece and it's poetic. It doesn't rhyme. I'm not insane. But interestingly, it's basically a long speech and it has poetic qualities to it. One of the tricks is, again, for those who've seen the movie, Nikki is a brilliant actress, and so is Stephen Lang, and so is Ian. And when you have actresses of that quality, they can make lines their own, even though people really don't talk the way they do. Right. With good actors, you're not sitting there thinking, oh, I don't think she would say this. You're kind of like hypnotized by the rhythms of what she's saying and her intensity and her focus, and the underscoring really helps a lot. So, it wasn't a poem in the sense of, a sonnet. It's not in iambic pentameter, but it's very highly rhythmic. But the rhythmics, working with the actor, allow you, with a good actor, allow you to kind of get into the flow and get into that same state, that head state that you would kind of experience when you're listening to a poem. The original version, I knew the music was going to be very, very important to this, and I got a copy of American Prayer, which is the album that came out after Jim Morrison died, and they had all this poetry of his. Again, it wasn't rhyming poetry; it was just kind of poetry, and they scored it with music after he was dead, and it was quite haunting. And I couldn't find anything there that really matched the music that I was looking for. But I took a song by the Doors, The End, and I took the first opening frame, few bars, and I created a loop in Final Cut, and I used that to underscore her dialogue, her speech, her poem, if you will. And I used that as a sample for my composer, and he composed something very different. You wouldn't think there's any relationship to the song, but he got that because this was this moment, this kind of very rhythmic moment, it needed to be underscored in a certain way. Now, this is an area where if you're not the director, right, you are going to have a problem. And it's like, how am I going to convey this in such a way that it's going to seem part of the movie, and so we were playing around. I worked very closely with Alexander Janko, who composed the score for it. So yeah, when I'm saying poem, in a sense, it was a long speech that happens to be poetic.
So let me ask you too, because I know there's a story here, but I can't remember it. How did you get into the movie business? What was it? And what was your, what was your first job? What was?
Well, my first job was I was a driver for Orson Welles. I mean, if you look at my IMDb page, that's where you'll find that, which is an interesting experience actually.
So because you were a kid and you just needed a job, or you thought, I want to get into the movie business?
Well, I certainly wanted to be in the movie business, but I was it was basically a way to make money without working, I thought. Now I'm working and not making money. Yeah. doing low budget movies. But I think there was a flippancy to me when I was young, and I think it was only as I kind of went through my 20s that I started to really take it very, very seriously as an art form, to the point where one of the reasons I'm making these low-budget movies is because I don't want to make Halloween Resurrection or movies that you get paid a lot of money for, but you're not very happy with artistically.
Which you've also done.
Which I've also done, which is how I can afford to live in the 35th floor.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you need to kind of balance it a little bit, I think. But yeah, the artistic part of it grew. I was not the most mature. I'm not the most mature person now, but I certainly wasn't in my 20s. But I think at a certain point I got focused. It was like, as soon as you start getting movies made and you're not happy with the way they make it. I mean, the movie that Rebecca and I wrote, Backfire, was so respectfully directed by Gil Cates, who was like a father to us. And he begged us to come visit the set, which is unheard of by a director, basically because he thought the producer was a moron. And he wanted to have somebody that he could have a conversation with. But I would look at the movie and I would say, yeah, but he's using zooms and I wouldn't use a zoom. So even though he was kind of followed the script very, very closely, you still get, it's not quite the way you want it, so you start directing. But I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid, so it wasn't something, I didn't grow up watching, imbibing movies the way a lot of people do. I loved them, and the one maybe hint that you would have is that if I show up in school and I just saw a movie, and I would talk about the movie to my friends, I would talk about the score and then the angle, so I was very specific about when I'd watch them, so maybe you could see in there the budding filmmaker. But I wasn't one of these kids who just, grew up watching every movie ever made. I was more influenced by TV shows like Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents when I was a kid, and novelists like Walker Percy. And so I was, and again, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar by any means, but the rhythms of Shakespeare, the kind of language, the use of language is very, very influential.
And what about you?
Well, I grew up in a small town in Kentucky, and we, had one TV channel for a while, and then we got two, but I watched the same shows that Larry's talking about, and we had the one movie theater where, you would go on Saturdays and watch the double features, but I can't say that movies were my thing, because my first job was at 16 on stage in a summer theater, and so I kind of went the theater route first, and got my degree as a performer, a BFA in acting, and went to New York to be in the theater. And quickly got involved in the comedy clubs there, and that led to my getting seen as a performer to go out to Los Angeles and do these shows that I mentioned. And at the time, being from Kentucky, there was every Southern show known to man, so I kidnapped Loretta Lynn on Dukes of Hazzard and forced her to hear me sing. That was a great plot. And, there was Flo and Sheriff Lobo and all of those Southern shows. And that's when I was like, ugh, is this, and I'd been in several Shakespeare companies. And I toured in the acting company with Kevin Kline and Patti LuPone and worked with John Houseman. And now I'm out there going, freeze, you wear the tank top, I'll wear the jeans. So that's when I met Larry and went into writing, which I found much more liberating. Series acting is hard in that you're waiting around all the time. And, you are unless you're the star, you're you're moved around, or you're told to wait, you're there at 6 p.m. in full makeup, and you work at noon, and it's not a difficult job, but it wasn't my job, you know, and this is much more me, but I was not a closet writer. I wasn't the little girl with the drawer full of little notes or the diary or any of that. I was not a writer until I met Larry and we started that.
So, because you've worked in television, let's talk about the writer's room. I'm assuming that you had more than just you assume the position and...
On Assume the Position, there were just 3 of us.
Okay.
And it was Robert Wall, the star, and first it was Alan Stephen, and then it was Will Reiser for the second one. And because it was a history show, this was the biggest challenge in the writer's room, because we had to digest history in blocks, bring it to today, which was what made the show work, and then make it funny. But we were workshopping at least 3 times a week. We would go out to schools in Los Angeles, to colleges, LA College, UCLA, and Robert would test out 5 minutes of material, 10 minutes of material, and then we would serve them pizza. That was our calling card. You know, we put it up on their bulletin board, come to room so-and-so, we have pizza, and here's some comedy. And they would come, and what we found out about that is we couldn't mention something like the Scopes monkey trial. They had no idea what that was, and then bring it to today, because we didn't have time to explain, and by the time we got to the joke, we were, you know, way past it. So that was an interesting that was a mobile writer's room. You know, every day, go out, stay, you know, next day, stay in the room, then go out again. And it wasn't like the Arliss Writers' Room, which had a complete staff of writers. I think there were 8 of us, plus Robert. And
Any other women?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
And how much time, like in the writer's room, every time I've been in a writer's room, I'm afraid.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, why are they talking about this stuff? It's nothing to do with the show. We've got to get on the clock here, you know?
Oh, well, and Robert, the star, the writer, the producer, and, you know, the side editor of the show, we had this young writing couple, and Robert started talking about Cat Ballou, and you could see they hadn't seen it. And the 2 of us that have known Robert for 30 years kind of went, oh. And the next thing, Robert sent the assistant out to get the DVD of Cat Ballou so we could all sit there and watch Cat Ballou and sing along with the songs, because he couldn't believe they hadn't seen it, and he wanted them. And it was like, all right, here we go. And you can't leave and go take a nap. I like Cat Ballou, but, you know. You would have gone nuts.
No, I would have gone nuts. I would have shut the whole operation down, take the day off or whatever. I wanted to talk a little bit about, this week is Oscar week, and I'm going to try to remember all the films that are nominated for the writing, but do you remember?
Wow, that's a tough one.
Well, let's skip over that bad. We're not going to be able to conjure that up. But what did you?
I think I'd have better luck trying to name the foreign films.
Okay, so but what did you see this year that you thought was extraordinary as far as writing?
Wow. Problem is, I see probably 300 movies in theaters. I mean, screenings. The Directors Guild screens movies like 2 to 4, sometimes 6 a week. So
right.
I see that many in theaters, not counting the ones I see at home, which maybe adds another 200 or 300. So it's great, but I just forget what I've seen 2 minutes after I've seen it. I know I liked American Hustle a lot. I liked the Scorsese picture. I think it was a fun kind of crazy, and that was a little more improvisational. I think David O. Russell is much more script-oriented. Scorsese lets the actors play, but they're both, certainly what was on the screen was well written. I'll give an example of a movie that was poorly written that's probably going to win the Academy Award, which is Gravity. which makes a lot of just, to me, writers' mistakes. Like
We have
people
this-
talking about stuff that they should have talked about long before the camera started rolling. Like you're in a spaceship with this girl, and now you're just finding out that she's married and has a kid or what. I mean, it's kind of that's just bad writing. It's just kind of it's the writer not putting himself in the position of the reality of that moment. If that moment is, people don't have that conversation knowing that the camera just came on. They would have had that conversation a long time ago. And there are always ways to finesse that. It's what I call thanks for telling us. It's information that the writer has to convey to us and can't do it elegantly. So it's like, I'm your brother. You ever hear people in real life saying, I'm your brother? Or
I'm your brother and I respect you.
But that's like an example of bad writing. Although I think it was very well directed. I think the directing was quite extraordinary, but the writing was not very good.
This is off the writing topic, but my issue was when Buzz Lightyear showed up in the film. And, Clooney is Buzz Lightyear, right?
Yeah.
And he's zooming around in the movie.
Well, he's zooming around and, I don't have my mic. He's zooming around, and please explain the scientific impossibility of.
Oh yeah, you know what? If you do a movie called Gravity, you shouldn't understand how gravity works. I mean, it is in the title of the movie. It's actually the title of the movie. And since I was going to be a scientist, when she is desperately trying to pull him, and he's once that line has extended itself fully, they're all in the same orbit at that point. So essentially, he's weightless. So it would pull him back. She was acting as if he was hanging off a cliff. So the physics of that is just totally, and it's kind of like there's always solutions. The problem I have, there's certain elements in movies that are false, but they kind of have to be false. I'm not going to criticize The Exorcist because I don't believe people are really possessed. I mean, that's what you buy your
Right.
ticket, and that's willing suspension of disbelief. That's an unfair criticism. But with the real elements, you have to stick to the rules you're playing by. If you're playing by the rules of this universe, then, that gravity works a certain way. And there are always ways to solve those problems. There's always a way to get that moment of drama without having to cheat. And to me, that's just kind of laziness in the writing, when you cheat rather than simply find an elegant way. And like I was saying about the information, there's elegant ways to find out that somebody's the brother. There's elegant ways to find out backstory without, having it read as false or read as informational, because the writer can't find a better way to get this out.
Can we ask questions at this point?
Yes, give us one more minute here. Let's let Rebecca.
Okay, I just wanted to say that the others are Blue Jasmine, this is Best Original, Dallas Buyers Club, Her, and Nebraska.
Well, I would go with Her just because it's the most original. And as a writer, to me, always like originalities.
Yeah, mine was Nebraska.
Nebraska was terrific.
I think that's what I voted for, was Nebraska, so.
And I didn't get to see Her because we do live in Northwest Michigan, and Jim and I have to drive 50-mile round trip to the cinema, so it's the snow zone this year, so there were a couple that I missed, but I did see 4 of the 5, so.
Okay, and at that, I'd like Jim to come up. And we're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to have questions because we have some time. This is Jim Carpenter. He works with Rebecca and Larry. Got on the best shirt.
I got 4 tips.
Okay.
As a producer, wannabe writer, doesn't matter what you write on, paper, computer. In my experience, because I did write a collection of short stories, I wrote most of it on paper, and my editing process began when I put it on the computer. Okay? Next thing, we've been involved with staged readings over the years at clubs. I strongly recommend, because I'm sure there are some of you that just got the writing bug at this particular festival, join up with a bunch of friends, because there's nothing better than hearing your work read, particularly friends that you trust, that there's no dynamic in there about personality clashes or are they being rude or whatever. Third, from a producer's standpoint, when you do get your screenplay purchased and you're being delivered to the show or to the set? Travel insurance. We're in Northwest Michigan, allow 2, and now we're going to recommend 3 days to get to a festival, because that's just the way it is.
Okay, so, thank you very much. I want to talk about how Rebecca, Jim, and I live in Northwest Michigan in the Snow Bowl. Larry lives in New York City. Some of you live in Sedona, I'm assuming, true?
Yes.
Okay, so how does this work and how do you work together, and what's that process like?
You may want to start on that.
Well, when Larry and I lived across the courtyard from each other, we never wrote in the same room. We override each other. We come up with a plot and we do beats, and then we go away. How much time would you say we actually spent together?
As little as possible. No, I think every team, I don't know how many of you are any of you in writing teams here? A few people? Every team has its own way of working, and some people like to bounce ideas back and forth, and that's perfectly fine. Whatever works for you. I hate looking at a blank page, and Rebecca hates the responsibility of something that's finished. So she would do the first drafts, and then I would give her notes, and she might do another draft, and then I would do drafts over that, and then she would give me notes on my drafts, and then. There was a while back, Rebecca did an interview for her local paper when she was living in Kentucky, and the way she explained it, she was good with character, story, and dialogue, and I was a good typist.
And they spelled his name Bland.
That was actually a second interview you did. Needless to say, she's never done an interview alone again. Fortunately, it was for the Kentucky paper, not my hometown paper, which is the New York Times. So I took it with a grain of salt.
Let me talk briefly about ideas, too. It's fascinating to watch these two work together as a team. Larry goes for a 5 to 7 mile walk every day in New York, and I'm sure things jump into his mind then. Rebecca is famous for waking up from a nap and going right to the computer with ideas. So it's always amazing how those ideas or a plot point comes together in something else that you're doing.
And I would like to say something. When he said I would do a draft, we go all the way through it. We don't go, hey, listen to this 2 pages.
Oh yeah, it's a full draft of everything.
Yeah, we're not calling each other up and saying, we like to surprise each other. And the worst note we can give each other is the dreaded thanks for telling us.
Right.
That is like, oh, and we're, if we get a check by a line, that means, oh, it's a rave from the other one.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not looking to each other for approval, or we're just trying to get out the best script. And Kathleen once asked, how long would it take for us to come up with a first draft together? And I think in the system where we just sit down and we do it and we pass it back and forth, what would you say?
Well, it could be 4 to 8 weeks. I mean, 8 weeks to be comfortable with the draft, but it really depends. You get lazy when you're not hungry, which is kind of just human nature. The one script I wrote that was I think a good script that I wrote very quickly was the first movie I got made as a director called The Drifter, and we had 2 development deals, which is where you basically paid to write something, and you pitch to a studio, and then you may pitch to 100 studios, and finally you get it set up and you write it, and you've already got a lot of people telling you how to change it before you've even written it. So it's kind of a frustrating experience. And we had 2 of those, and there was a 4-week gap between the 2. And so I had this idea circulating for the Drifter, and I sat down and I wrote it in 4 weeks just because I was so driven to get that out there. But normally, I think 8 weeks is a little bit more comfortable. If I'm working with Rebecca, it's going to take a little longer because she's going to do her stuff and I'm going to do mine. I think the only point where we're actually communicating and agreeing initially is on the plot. We have to kind of know where the plot is going. So then we'll kind of work in unison, and it could be over the phone, or, you know, you don't need to be in the same room, so. But
So you do it all long distance for the most part?
yeah, because for most of the time, I've known Rebecca for over 30 years, and most of that, we've lived in different cities. I mean, she was in Kentucky, and I was in LA, and now I'm in New York, and she's in Michigan. So, I mean.
I think you can see my plan is working.
And where were you living before Northern Michigan?
In Kentucky.
In Kentucky?
I have lived and worked in New York and Los Angeles, and after staying in Los Angeles 5 years, I decided to move back home to Kentucky to be around my family. I'd been gone for quite a while. And the good news is I met Jim.
And why were you in Kentucky?
I actually was working in education at the Tennessee Valley Authority, running a living history farm, a nature center, and a planetarium. Big 170,000 acre tract of land.
There's a story.
Yet another story.
Okay, so let's open up the discussion here, and I'm going to repeat the question that you asked. So, Mr. UCLA.
How do you come up with the title? Like The Girl on the Train, I went and looked it up, and I found another movie from 2009 with Catherine Deneuve. The title's an important thing. How do you come up with a title that's unique and catchy?
How do you
Well-
come up with the title, and what are the pitfalls of your title?
Well, this is a very personal thing. I either come up with a perfect title right off the bat, or it's torture for me to come up with a good title. The legality of titles is there's no copyright on a title. In fact, every movie I've ever written, if you go back far enough, I wrote a movie called The Drifter in the mid-'80s, and there was no modern movie called The Drifter, oddly enough, because it's a pretty good title. But there was a movie like in the way back, like 60, 80 years ago, that was called The Drifter. We found it. I even wrote a movie called Till the End of the Night, and oddly enough, there was a movie called that. Our first movie, Backfire, there was a backfire. And there's an agreement between the studios where they have to get permission to use a title. So even though it's not like a copyright thing, it's not the government isn't going to come and get you. The studios want to own that title, and they made us try to come up with an alternate title because they didn't want to pay for it, and it was torture. We had like pages and pages of, and ultimately I don't know what happened. They wound up using Backfire. So it wasn't an issue anymore. Titles are important. Here's an odd little quirk of modern day social media and the way people rent movies. They want a title that's high in the alphabet. An A is better than a Z because that's when people are looking on Netflix. They start at the A. So that's a silly kind of a thing. I wouldn't ever change a title for that. But it's something that,
My next movie is Aardvark. So don't try to take that title.
And oddly enough, it's a murder mystery.
And I agree with this because I've been doing some internet stuff, and I've heard that when you have if you have a domain name that is just, the straight name without the in front of it, if you had to sell it down the road, it's worth a lot more money than if it has the. That's just a little aside there. But I also did the titling thing because I did a television show called The Awful Truth, and there was a movie called The Awful Truth. But, we were able to use it, and it was just some kind of deal between a couple of studios. So.
Yeah, also, obviously, if it's a huge, you're not going to name a movie Jaws or The Exorcist, something that is clearly recognizable, because it's just silly. So
you're not going to do Gravity, the real story?
well, with the colon, it works.
And from a social marketing point of view, if you can come up with an original title, you're better off, because then you're not competing for domains, you're not competing for what's your Twitter account.
And we're the Girl on the Train US, to answer UCLA's question. On Facebook, we had to be the Girl on the Train, capital U, capital S.
Okay, over here.
My question's going to be related to managers, but I wanted to add one more thing to the copyright thing based on IP law. If it is trademarked, there's merchandising around it, you can't take the title.
Right.
Example, Jaws and like Star Wars and things like that. But as far
Are you in that business?
well, I have a lawyer that did that for me for a
Okay.
show that I had.
Okay.
So
And what's your question?
the question is around management these days as writers. How important do you think, given the new state of Hollywood and you know, the difficulty in terms of getting scripts turned into films, even more so now probably than ever in history, how important are managers and the middlemen, kind of agents, in terms of, you know?
Okay, his question is, do you need a manager if you're a writer to help you get to the people that you need to get to?
Or an agent.
Or an
Right.
agent.
Or an agent, yeah.
Yeah, well, managers and agents are different, they have different functions, although they very often act very similarly. It's very important, it's harder to, I mean, I don't have an agent or manager now, because we're making our own movies, but it's really, for bigger projects, it's a requirement. And I've been really bad and lazy at going out and getting agents. It's one of the things I'm not really good at, is I'm selling myself to an agent. So it is very important. It's also very hard without credits to get an agent. These days, I think, you know, most people starting out as screenwriters or filmmakers in general wind up doing indie projects, and you know, the means of production is at anybody's hand. I mean, you can buy a camera for a couple of $1,000 and go off and shoot your first movie. It is hard to get an agent that is going to do you any good, and a manager as well. Sometimes, you know, but they do have different functions. Managers often produce, agents aren't allowed to produce. So you know, it's not an easy thing to do to get an agent. Usually a good script will eventually, you know, there was an experiment done probably about 20 years ago where they retitled Casablanca, and they sent it out to like dozens and dozens of agents, and like 3 of them even recognized it. You know, so you're not dealing, back when we were starting out, like, it sounds like, you know, grandpa, but in the 80s even, which isn't that long ago, there was some sense of agents wanting to cultivate a career and liking starting out with a new writer, or, you know, it doesn't have to be a young writer, but a new writer. Now I think it's just so much about the business that it's very hard to get somebody's attention. There are agents out there that are good and that really will try to find something and are about the material and not something that's just sounds like it's this month's flavor. But I think it's gotten a little harder. But the other side of it is it is easier to get your own movies made because of the technology. I made The Drifter for the same amount of money that we made Girl on the Train, and that was 25 years ago. And I couldn't imagine how we could make The Drifter back then for the budget we had, which in today's money would probably be like $2 million, you know, and because of digital technology, you can do that, and you couldn't do that. The bottleneck is different. Back when we were starting, the bottleneck was in getting your movie made. Once you got it made, you were kind of in a club. Now, pretty much anybody can get a movie made. The bottleneck is whose movies are going to be distributed and seen by anybody.
My name's Neil Housen. First of all, I appreciate this. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. When you start off with a script, I find I just want to start off with dialogue, period. I don't want to, and I've picked up today, don't worry about the close-up or anything else. Is that a good starting point?
You know, there are no rules. Oh, I'm sorry, is dialogue a good starting point is the question. I'm sorry, you know, there are no rules other than telling a good story. I think keep it simple, stupid is the best advice I can give in terms of just making sure it's clear what the story is and what's on the screen. That's what I always try to do. I always try to give the reader the impression that they understand what's happening on the screen and who's saying what. A friend of mine, who's now a teacher at Drexel, once wrote a script where every character's name was Dave. There were 7 Daves in the movie. Now, it's a very funny idea. It gets a laugh. I have no idea how he did it or if it was any good, but clearly that's not an example of being, you know, easy on the reader. So I'd say, you know, there are no rules other than are other people going to understand it and they're going to like it. So if the dialogue is good, start with it. I love dialogue. Dialogue is very much what I do in my movies, but it still has to be around a story. So.
I would just like to add one thing to that. Sometimes I like to just, because dialogue is also easy for me, and coming from theater and playwriting where it's 90% dialogue, sometimes I like to just go through the visual in my head and then go back to the dialogue. You know, just kind of try to see the movie like the sound were off. So.
Yeah, there you go.
Do you ever write with a message in mind? And if you do, is it a message in a plot, or is it a plot with a message?
do you ever write with a message in mind? And when you do, is the message in the plot or
The plot. with
the
it.
plot in the message? Oh my gosh, that makes me want to cry.
Wow. This is the longest she's ever gone without crying.
Oh, no, I think she
I
cried
have to
already.
think that out.
Well, it depends on how you mean message. If you mean message by some kind of a political or social message, no, that's not what I do. Certainly, there are many, many, many layers of meaning and stuff that the movie is about that is always going to be there. And sometimes it can be interpreted as a social message or even a political message, and that's fine. All art should be interpretable. But in terms of which comes first, usually it's the plot. I don't discover what a movie's about until I've got the plot out there. I don't sit there saying, I mean, the movie Girl Without a Train is about how we construct images of each other, that when we're in love with somebody, are we in love with that person or our own constructed image of that person? How much of what we see is real, how much of it is a story? So the movie's very much about narrative versus reality, and the constant question asked in the movie is, would you prefer a great love or a great story? That's what the characters actually talk about. So as I'm developing it, and I'm coming up with these lines of dialogue which come from somewhere, it's obviously some kind of gestalt is happening in my brain, but I don't consciously set out to come up with a certain line or a certain piece of dialogue. And you kind of discover it as you're going along, that's what this movie's about. And then, because I work in successive drafts, and then I go back and I say, well, if it's about that, then I have to add this here, and kind of. So every movie I've ever done, I could sit there, I could write a dissertation on what the movie's really about, beyond the plot. But usually the plot comes first. And in modern filmmaking, certainly since the Coen brothers came up with Blood Simple 30 years ago, 30 years ago, there's a third layer which is no requirement, but most filmmakers have to acknowledge it, which is, where does this film stand in the history of film? What commentary is it making about other films? Now, most movies don't, action-adventure movies don't need to do this, horror movies don't, a lot of dramas don't, but the kind of filmmaking I do, which is basically neo-noir film, is very much about, the first thing is the plot, the second thing is what's the movie really about, the subtext, and that third layer, where does this movie stand in relation to other movies and films that have come before it? That may only be observable by film students, and that's fine. The plot is really what matters. What the movie is about is, to me, matters equally. If you have that third layer in there, which is very much what I try to do with Girl on a Train, because it's about not only about the images that we have of each other, but the way we tell stories. So the movie becomes recursive, it becomes about itself. So the characters in the movie are constructing stories that mirror the way I'm constructing the story of the movie itself. And that this is something that's been happening for 30 years of film. That's what Quentin Tarantino does, and Rodriguez, and all these kind of modern filmmakers. And precursors were Scorsese, which kind of modernized film noir. So, but I would say certainly the plot comes first. Some idea comes first, for me. And then, because otherwise it becomes polemical. If I sit there and I think, I'm going to do a movie about relationships and about the way we perceive each other, then it's a little bit artificial. It's much more natural for me to come up with a plot and then say, okay, this is why this intrigues me. It intrigues me because this is why this plot occurred to me. Even in The Drifter, which is my first movie, and it's a Roger Corman movie, as I used to say, what's your Corman movie? Well, it's a Corman movie. Somebody gets killed, somebody gets fucked. But it was really about relationships, and it was in a very kind of casual sex post-70s kind of period, and it was about how meaningful relations are or should be. So it had another level about what it was about, even though on the plot level, it was about a guy stalking a girl. They have a one-night stand and he won't take no for an answer. So that's the plot, but the movie's really about our relationship to our animal nature and how divorced we've come from that. So every movie I've ever done has that layer of what it's really about. And the movies of my own movies that I like more, because you don't always like all of your movies, are the ones where the subtext is more interesting to me than than other movies, where it's kind of like, well, yeah, the subtext really, it's not what it's about is not really that important, I think. So,
Just a quick business update on messages. At the Berlin Film Market, we're in the process of seeking distribution, foreign distribution for both of our films. At the recent Berlin Film Market, the variation on this that kept popping up was, your film has to have a hook. Okay? So
Not
whatever-
necessarily a message.
Whatever that means.
well, I would say a hook is kind of the old idea of a high concept, and could you shout this across a parking lot in one sense? And that's fine, and as I was talking about plot helping out a movie, I think even though I'm not a hook type writer, I think that it does help to, commercially, if you do have something, it's about, the old joke used to be, it's Die Hard in a blank, they would say, it's Die Hard in a fast food restaurant, whatever. The hook is it's not something that I particularly do or like, but it certainly does add into the commercial viability if it's something that you can kind of express in a simple formula.
And it does help you. I mean, Die Hard meets Jaws at an amusement park. Sharknado. And the one I remember from the late 80s was Blind Date. This is one you can scream across a parking lot. Blind Date. Sure, she's beautiful, just don't get her drunk.
Yeah.
And,
The guy got paid a fortune just for that one line. He's
For
an
that
established
one
writer,
line.
but yeah.
But, I mean, because everybody fears that the blind date's gonna not be beautiful, and then plot ensues, don't get her drunk, so,
Right, and that's like a punch-up line.
yes.
Somebody writes the script, and then, you start making the film, and then you hire punch-up writers.
Right.
And they get paid outrageous sums of money to, write a couple jokes. I mean, huge amounts of money. Okay, back there, right there, white shirt, you.
Do screenwriters have an interest in people who write books but know nothing about screenwriting? Are you ever approached someone who says, hey, I've written a book, do you want to look at it for becoming, do you guys personally do that, or do other people do that? Because they're very different skills, aren't they? I mean, I can't imagine working on a book, I can't imagine writing a screenplay.
So the question is, do you ever get pitched by a writer with a book for you to write the script?
Or even if you don't, is that something that ever happens with you or with other screenwriters?
In our case, now that we've formed a film company, we do get pitched books. There are a lot of writers in our area, but we have a lot of ideas. And until we've done our own ideas and followed, itches that we have a couple of things that we really are eager to do. Until we do those, we're really not looking. But saying that, we get a lot of people saying, I've got a great idea, you should write. And what I try to say to people is, I think it's your great idea and you should write it. And then I say, 1 page a day, 120 days a screenplay, 2 pages. You try to get people to we want to do our own stuff. It's not easy to produce movies from northern Michigan, but we got to that place, the three of us working on, 3 features now because we wanted to do our own stuff. We didn't want studios asking us questions like, can a grown man be called Danny? It's like, yes, a grown man can be called Danny. It's like, oh, those are peas and carrots, baby. So he's laughing over here. He's obviously been down this road. So, it's a different skill to write a novel and to write a screenplay. Some people do that, do both. I think one of the adapted ones, I can't think which one it is right now, that's nominated this year was by the author of the book. I can't think which one it is. Larry, do you want to address? Okay.
I wanted to bring up at this point, because we're in this, little bit of this conversation is about that they have a company that they live in northern Michigan, I live in northern Michigan, how this works. And the way I was able to be in northern Michigan and continue to produce films was really because of the internet. And I used to have, AOL dial-up down the road to a place called Kalkaska, which I had to pay long distance for. So every time I was on the internet, I'm paying all these long distance bills, but that's how it started, and that's how I was able to stay there. So just an aside about you can be here and do it too, and be connected and be involved in the film festival and et cetera. Last year when I was here, there was a panel about film distribution, and we had, I think, 3 different distributors here, and talking about indie film distribution, et cetera. And it was, really great. I learned a lot myself, and later on, I saw, with a very bad toothache, I saw their film Girl on the Train, and I saw it in Traverse City. Was it a rough cut, or was it finished?
I think it was almost finished.
Yeah, it was almost finished, and so I saw the film, and then maybe a few months later, a few weeks later, something, I sat there and I thought, wow. And I called Rebecca and I said, do you guys have a distributor? No. And I said, I think I know someone that might distribute your movie. And she was a woman that was on my panel here last year. And so I hooked them up, and
That's who's distributing our movie, Monterey Media. They have 3 films here, The Girl on the Train, Girl on a Bicycle, and The Redwood Highway. It's the transportation series.
so my point to you is that it can happen here. I mean, that was just 1 degree. I mean, I wasn't in the business of getting their film distributed. It just dawned on me one day that I could put these 2 people together, and I did, and they did the work. But, you can be here and have it happen.
I have a question about editing. Did you edit your film?
Yeah, I edited both films. On Girl, I worked with my editor, who I've actually did my first movie with. We hadn't worked together in like over 20 years, and he was available. But what happened was there was a huge period where we didn't have him on board yet. So I had like 6 or 8 weeks. So I did the first cut myself, and then he came on board and whined and complained about everything, and beat me up. And he's very undiplomatic, which is what I like in an editor. You want somebody who's just going to run you rake you over the coals. But I'd already edited Coexist, so my editing skills were already there. And as director, I've always been very, very hands-on as an editor. I wasn't physically editing the movie, but I was always very, in control of where all the cuts are. And I've always worked with the editor. I'm not like and I'd say that usually what happens when you work with an editor is, in retrospect, you look back and 70% are probably still the original cuts, but there's a lot of stuff that so my sense of cutting and timing is already very down. So making the shift to editing, if there were another part of filmmaking that I would be good at, it wouldn't be, cinematography or it's not anything like that, but editing I think is something I could probably do pretty well, so it came naturally.
That's what I'm doing now. I directed a film and now
Right.
learn Final Cut because
Yeah.
I feel the same way. But I had someone say to me, as the director, you're too close to it. I don't feel that way.
Well, you do have to show it to a lot of people. The first cut of Coexist Comedy Tour was 25 minutes longer than the current cut. And a lot of that got, because I showed it to a lot of people. Girl on the Train probably came down about 15 to 20 minutes. They all come down a lot because you get to the point where you think it's really good. And then people tell you, it's not really that good. And then, so you have to always be listening to others. So there's ways to get around it. I've always had the ability, and I refer to it as getting outside your own head. I can always look at what I've written and kind of look at it as if somebody else had written it. Now, I still have the same aesthetic, so it doesn't, I haven't transformed myself into somebody else where I can look at it differently, but I can look at it as if I hadn't written it, if that makes any sense. So it's natural for me to be very, very highly editorial, and I'm very good at taking criticism, and it helps because it's like, you came up with a better line, it's like, now I'm going to take credit because she came up with a better way of doing this. But you can do, but it does require discipline. And I think that, there are people who just cannot take criticism, and generally that's not a good sign. You know, Larry David is known for not taking criticism, and he's brilliant. Some people are really good at they know what they want, they don't like criticism, and they're good at it. Most of us really need to be able to take criticism well. Other people take it too well. I mean, people are too willing to change everything because somebody else said. It's really a line to walk there, where you're enough into your own groove that you're not going to be over-influenced, but you're enough outside your own head that you can take good advice when you hear it.
Who do you show it to? 'Cause it's-
I want to show it to Rebecca and Jim first. I have a bunch of filmmaker friends in LA that I show it to. I show it to my brother, who I was always afraid is going to be too, because I'm his older brother. He's not going to be critical enough. But actually, on the last two movies, he gave me really good notes. So usually it's just people that you trust. And the other thing I find is, as a director, even if I don't edit the movie, when I show it to a crowd, even if it's one person, I look at it differently. Because now all of a sudden I feel this responsibility to not bore that person. So even if the person is asleep and I don't know it, there's another human being in the room, I just watch the movie differently myself. So beyond, because sometimes people just won't give you much feedback, but it always helps to watch it with other people.
I have one more thing to say about feedback. You have to know and trust people giving you your feedback. You know, working with Larry and working with Robert all this time, we only want the better it. You know, we have no agenda, so it's who you listen to. Make sure you trust that, you know, they're taking care of you and your project. That's...
Well, also the element, there is no ego in it. Now, all of us have big egos, I promise you. That's not what it's about. But it's about the ego not being invested in the work. I mean, the worst excuse, two bad excuses for leaving something in a movie. One is that it happened in real life, because who cares? People make the mistake of telling a true story, and they're invested because this really happened. Some things happen all the time that you would never believe in a movie. So if you're doing something based on a true story, know what to leave behind and what to embellish and so on. The other thing is, the other piece of bad filmmaking is, it's there because I like it. I don't care if you like it. It has to be right for the movie.
Right, you have to let that stuff go.
This guy's had his hand up.
I'll throw a word out first. Excuse me, serendipity. And you started off with that in the beginning when you were talking about Coexist. And this is a question that I didn't understand. It sounded like you were doing an event video, and then something happened with the Christian comedian.
Yeah, we shot. He's asking. I'm sorry. He's asking about serendipity in the making of the documentary, and how that happened with the losing the Christian in the one night shoot. It was originally supposed to be we had the 6 comedians on stage in Sacramento one night, packed house, shooting the show as a concert video. The Christian, Jew, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist. And then as I was cutting that together, cutting the performances together, we learned that the Christian had left the show, or was refusing to sign his contract to be in the movie. So that's when this plot kind of entered. But serendipity is extremely important in filmmaking. With the other movie, we have The Girl on the Train, and if the people who've seen the movie, they've heard the story, I apologize. But there's an element in there that's based on a real-life story. A friend of mine just sent me this email about this concentration camp survivor who had this fascinating story to tell. And I looked it up, and I found out there was more to it than met the eye. I'm not going to give it away because people haven't seen the movie yet. There's more to it than met the eye. And it was so perfect for the story I was telling, which is a story about stories. It was like the god of filmmaking had just kind of winked at us. So I immediately incorporated that into the... so you really have to be alert to serendipity when you're a filmmaker or a writer or any kind of artist. You know, you also can't be too... You know, I know we're in Sedona here, land of crystals and, you know, that stuff. So you can't just automatically think everything is a sign. I saw a movie the other night, I think it was the one with Dreyfus, where he says, and I love the line because she says she believes in science, but she just doesn't know how to interpret them. You know, I think it's a great line. I just love that line because I kind of feel that way too. I'm always presented with these signs. I don't just know what it means, but I know it's a sign.
We have to-
We actually have to end, so I'm really sorry. But, yeah, we have to be out of here by 10:30, so. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This was great. Thank you, Rebecca, Larry.